Joe sends me this text, and for a quick second, I thought he was pregnant. Turns out he has COVID and is pretty knocked out. So Joe's not with us this week, but the show must go on. But luckily for us, Joe actually has an identical twin brother called Joey. But Joey has this speech problem where like his voice and his lips don't really match up, something like that. Joey, maybe you can explain it a little better.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on. I have a condition called ventriloquism syndrome. Very rare. I prefer the phone and am somewhat counterintuitively, I am not invited to parties that much.
All right, well, we're gonna try this anyway. Here we go. This was supposed to be Joe's week to present. Obviously, he was completely knocked out by COVID, but this was a pretty good week for him, I'd say, because we had the FOMC meeting that happened this past week, and rates unchanged. Joe was also texting me maybe I could talk about the UK trade negotiations, which I can't. It's not really my bag, so it's kind of going to be one of my weeks. What I wanted to talk about was Scott Bessent today at the interview he did with Milken. So there were three things I thought that was pretty interesting that he mentioned that we're going to talk about. One had to do with Ray Dalio. He mentioned Ray Dalio, which I thought was pretty interesting in his context. The other thing had to do with the rapacious Chinese deals he mentioned. I thought we would dive into that. The final thing that he said that is could be like 5 of its own episodes. He just said that they're targeting the 10-year interest rate. So he made that explicit. We've mentioned that before on this show. And he said that there's quote unquote a lot of things wrapped in it, which is very much an understatement. Let's run the first clip.
Where do we end up with China? And I said during IMF week in Washington, said, it's possible that we could, as Ray Dalio might say, do a big, beautiful rebalancing. That if we want more manufacturing, everyone agrees except Chinese leadership that they need more consumption. We could actually do that together.
He said at the end there that everyone agrees except Chinese leadership that there needs to be more consumption. I took issue with that because they very much do agree that there needs to be consumption. And they've said as much in one of their recent, in their 5-year plans. It has to do with quote unquote dual circulation. So they have one of the circulations is external. So that's going to be, import export. That's what they call one circulation. And then the other one is the internal one. And they do explicitly say that they're doing this for, increased domestic consumption. So just a little side note, but that's not really what I wanted to focus on. The key point here was that he made a reference to Ray Dalio, which I thought was very interesting because Ray Dalio is very much convinced that if you zoom out far enough and you see all of history in terms of the rise and fall of great empires and world orders, as he calls them, he's convinced that the U.S. is currently on the decline and China is on the rise. And at some point, those two paths are going to cross. So the fact that, Bessent would mention Ray Dalio in sort of a positive, from a positive angle, I thought was kind of interesting. If not, maybe perhaps slightly misleading. What he's referring to is one of a recent X article that Ray Dalio had posted. He called it a U.S.-China beautiful rebalancing. And he just laid out the case as to what each country needs to do. But we also have to, in the context of some of the other articles that he's written, one of them is called It's Too Late, The Changes Are Coming. He posted that at the end of April. The other thing, don't make the mistake of thinking that what's now happening is mostly about tariffs. He's very much, in my view, kind of doom and gloom for the U.S.
Actually, Luke, can I interject real quick? I just want to double check to make sure that what you're saying is accurate. So let me look at the article. Don't make the mistake of thinking that what's now happening is mostly about tariffs. Interesting. So he talks about a classic breakdown of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders. Oh dear. He says more specifically, the monetary economic order is breaking down because there's too much debt. The rates of adding to it are too fast, and existing capital market. Oh, this doesn't sound good at all. He talks about the domestic political order that's breaking down. Interesting. The geopolitical order? is breaking down. They're saying acts of nature are increasingly disruptive, so even nature's against us. But I see here amazing changes in technology, such as AI, will be highly impactful. So I guess that's good. Okay. I take your point. Thank you.
Now, the other thing I wanted to mention was when we were coming up with the idea for this podcast, and we were, Joe and I were going back and forth and it's kind of working out. And you've seen this through for the previous episodes, how we've sort of zigged and zagged a little bit on what we should cover. There was one time where we considered putting everything through the perspective of Ray Dalio's thesis, which was that the US is declining and China is rising. So anything that we would cover, we would tie back to that thesis. Now that the interesting part about that is this is one spot where Joe and I disagree. Joe, I think, is less convinced of China's rise, whereas I think it's going to happen. Really, the only question mark is when. That's something that we don't really have a good answer, that I don't have a great answer for. I wanted to take also this chance to respond to a really cool comment that we got. This person was asking, for our opinion is, what are the implications of the new trade deals that China is signing with other countries? Is there a possibility of completely split global economy at some point? And the first thing I thought of was really the Ray Dalio comment, and I think what this person is somewhat alluding to, which is like a new global world order, like a complete split global economy would suggest as though there's a new order somewhere. And I think so. You have to look at this, I think, with the knowledge that everything comes to an end at some point. The corollary is to say that, okay, is the U.S. just going to be the dominant forever? And I think it's just no. I don't think that's in the cards. It's just a matter of when. The lines will cross, I think, most likely. If you look at the future probability tree, most likely that will happen when Taiwan is invaded. Personally, that's my view. I think that will happen, and that will be the cross. And I think the measure of the future leader from the U.S. side will be to navigate that crisis without any hot wars. So is there a possibility of complete split? Yes. Do I think it's going to happen? Yes. When? I don't know. A
few days later. And look, I think it's win-win. What it is not is one of these rapacious Chinese deals. Sign here, it's loan to own. You're going to default on the debt. We're going to own all your minerals, and that's life.
My interpretation of this, what he's referring to are kind of referred to as resource-backed loans, or RBLs. So that might be oil from Angola, copper and cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, bauxite from Ghana, chrome and platinum from Zimbabwe, things like that. These untapped resources are the collateral. So, in some cases they might, China might even be able to have gotten a claim on a certain percentage of the raw resource. If not that, then there's an understanding in the loan terms that the loan will be paid back in part by the sale of these commodities. Let's look at some of the Chinese loans to Africa. So there's this database by BU that I discovered. And just looking at this, oftentimes these resource-backed loans are referred to sort of as the Angola model. So this, if you can imagine, is Angola. And what they do is, a lot of these kind of energies, and you can see all the different loans that were given to them. So this one is the Chinese Import-Export Bank. And then you have the China Development Bank down here, and then, the various loans and the amounts. And a lot of what these are doing is they're saying, okay, we will build the infrastructure for you. And one of the ways, to collateralize the loan to make sure that we get our money back is to say, okay, if you don't, then we have a certain claim on the resources of your country. Where I think the rapacious part of all this comes in has to do with when part of the loan also dictates what contractors you have to use. So, the money that is spent to build this infrastructure is not even necessarily spent on local developers or local workers. what the Chinese will do is they'll import a bunch of Chinese migrants, Chinese contractors. The loan proceeds will then be given to those contractors to build the infrastructure, and then after the fact, China will even have access to those resources. So it's not even as though the money that's used is really even spent on local people, right? It's almost, it flows in and then it flows right back out. And then after that, China still has a claim, has a big asset in terms of, okay, well, we're going to need to get our money back, even though in some ways they already did. And if you want to think about it, it's like China Incorporated. And in that sense, I think it is somewhat rapacious.
Haha! Then I see that you are perhaps not familiar with this document that I found, How China Lends, a rare look into 100 debt contracts with foreign governments. This is a brilliant document, and really they found 4 ways in which the Chinese will issue loans that maybe are a little questionable. Let's look into it. Now, the first one that they mention is confidentiality. It looks as though the use of confidentiality clauses really were not too many before 2014, but then in 2015 afterwards, they were more exclusive. That's pretty strange. Here are some of the language. They really get into specifics, which I know you like. Here's the second one, seniority and security. Now, they provide some good context. It looks like the Chinese Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank use these clauses a little more than perhaps some of the other lenders. Now, what they're doing is quite interesting. What they're saying is the sovereign borrowers commit to maintain and fund accounts either at the lending institution or at a bank acceptable to the lender throughout the life of the loan, and to route through these accounts project revenues and or cash flows that are unrelated to the project funded by the loan. Now you can imagine what they're really using this for. They're saying, okay, the borrower needs to keep an account and I need to have access to it. So you can imagine if, say, they didn't pay, that they could just pull the money down themselves. This is unusual. I challenge you to think of any loan that you received, a student loan or a mortgage, that said you had to keep an account open and you had to flow all of your cash flows through it. I doubt it. Let's look at the third one. Seniority and no Paris Club. What they're looking for here is, well, let's just read some of the text. They'll put in language into the loan contract that says, the borrower shall, under no circumstances, bring or agree to submit the obligations under the finance document to the Paris Club for restructuring or into any debt reduction plan of the IMF, the World Bank, any other multilateral international financial institution to which the state is a part of, or the government of the PRC without the prior written consent of the lender. So basically what they're saying is that if the borrower gets into trouble and wants to do some generalized debt restructuring, you're going to keep this loan out of it. Now this is pretty aggressive. You'll notice that the no Paris Club clause, China uses it a lot more than some of the other creditors. And maybe this is another interesting point. Back to your comment about the comment that you had gotten, saying that they wanted to split in economic orders. This document, at the very least, doesn't really want to recognize the legitimacy of those other multilateral institutions, I would say. Food for thought.
Now you can see sort of over time, the Chinese loan commitments to Africa really sort of peaked around 2013, and then they were sort of up and extended in the teens. 2016, they were very high, 17, 18. After that, they started to decline. And if you put that, and if you just look at, that with the number of Chinese workers, it sort of follows a similar trend, as well as sort of the gross annual revenues of Chinese companies, construction projects in Africa. They kind of all follow the similar trend.
So then why do you think it's been declining since around 2019?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm really not sure. If you ask around, some people blame COVID. although that doesn't really explain why it started to drop off in 2019. Another thing that people say is that it's a part of the Belt and Road Initiative that was kind of pulled back sort of during those years. Although if you still look at the 5-year plan from just the recent 5 years, it's still on there. So hard to exactly pinpoint that. The other thing, it might just be that these deals, maybe they're not that good from the Chinese perspective. So you can find some instances of having to renegotiate the terms. Look at the next clip.
So I thought it was important to focus on the 10-year, and the 10-year has a lot of things wrapped in it. It's the short-term rates, it's the term premium, and we're focused on creating the best environment for stable rates.
The mainstream media really doesn't focus too much on interest rates. And I think that's because the stock market is just much easier to cover. So like we had an episode earlier to respect the bond market. That's really where the power is. But the stock market is just a lot friendlier to news folks. So it's much easier to interpret. It's much easier to understand. So, good is when it goes up, bad is when it goes down. Why did it go up? Oh, well, let's just look at the components of whatever index we're looking at. Oh, Amazon went up 10%. That's the driver. Let's just drill in a little farther. Oh, they had a really good earnings or whatever it is. It's just much, much clearer typically. The reasons for, what maybe drove it up or down, especially from, when we're looking at it in retrospect. By contrast though, the bond market and specifically sort of the 10-year yield on the US government is much, in my view, much messier, right? There are some positive factors that are going to push it up and some negative factors that are going to push it up. It's, much harder for people from the Wall Street Journal to really write clearly about, it's moving and then why. They don't really know. No one really knows. But at the same time, it's still a super important number. So you can look at the 10-year yield and it moves around day to day. But it's still very difficult to say exactly why. Maybe partly it's because inflation. So inflation is going to have an effect on the yield. Higher inflation means you're going to need higher yields. The other thing that's impacting it is the short-term rate. This is something that Bessent mentioned that's in there, quote unquote. So when the Fed drops rates, it should impact the 10-year. Maybe not nearly as directly as some of the shorter-term rates, but it is going to impact it. Another thing that's in there could be just simply the amount of debt that's outstanding. That's going to be a supply side impact. The other thing could be from the demand side. So the FRB, the Federal Reserve, could buy a whole bunch of debt and that could move the interest rates around. Credit questions. So this was something we covered earlier where the bond vigilantism out there in which they just, on the demand side, they just sold a whole bunch of it and that pushed yields up. So prices down, pushed yields up. But then on the other side, if there is very positive broad economic outlook, if sort of the, looking forward and they think the economy is going to be really good, that can also push yields up because there's less demand for something as safe as the US Treasury. Finally, the other thing that's in there has to do with just general global financial markets. If there's another country that has either more or less attractive yields, then that's going to push money into or out of the Treasury market. So overall, I would say, higher yields, bad, in part because the US needs to refinance this, and it's easier to do that when the cost of borrowing is low, but it's all mixed up and jumbled up in there. Lower is better. If it's lower, then that indicates that, people want our debt, that demand exceeds supply, that people, and what I mean by people, again, sophisticated investors and those listening to our podcast, feel good about the credit quality of the United States. And they feel good about the credit quality now. And what's also super important, they feel good about the credit quality in the future. So I think you should take that away with you. All right. Look, Thanks for listening. I'm Luke.
I am Joey.
This has been the Root of All Evil podcast. Talk to you later.